talk will be given by Eli Greenfender, and he will talk about soundscape concept and definition. And Eli, you have 20 minutes.
Yes. Can you
Yes.
see me? All right.
See here and see your screen. So you can start whenever you
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Eli Greenfender. I'm working at the Museum Natural d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris with Sylvain Aubert, Jérôme Sueur, that you have already seen. I'm also working with Christian Lorenzi from École Normale Supérieure. And I will give a presentation on soundscapes, understanding soundscape, and how we can understand what is a soundscape through a functional representation. I will only talk about non-anthropogenic terrestrial environments, but it is my personal belief that it is possible to use this proposition, this methodology, for different kinds of environments. So to start, we will talk about the origins of the soundscape with Murray Schafer's own definition. And he was describing in the 70s soundscape in terms of sound signals, sound marks, and keynotes, which would seem like rather musical terms. And William Gaver, 20 years later, talked about also ecological acoustics, but he talked about the physical origin of sounds, and he was talking about solid, aerodynamic, or liquid sounds. You can see that both of them were talking about ecology, but still this way of describing sonic environments doesn't really give us information about the ecological mechanism that lies behind those sounds. More recently, with the birth and the development of ecoacoustics, we had the contribution of ecoacousticians, and they tried to give a more scientific approach to soundscapes. First in 2011 with Pijanowski and a lot of ecoacousticians collaborators who proposed a definition that was based on the collection of sounds that emanate from a landscape and that vary over space and time, reflecting important ecosystem processes. And he even, at the time, proposed a first schematic representation, a first functional diagram, where he talked about natural and human sound sources that were building soundscape patterns. And then a little bit later, Almo Farina also proposed a different kind of definitions. And he was talking about an acoustic context that was perceived by different kinds of individuals. So you may think that those definitions look alike. And what I want to do here is to try to understand what are the differences using a functional diagram. So first, what we are going to do is we are going to use a picture, and with this picture, we're going to try to understand what are the different components that we will talk about later. First, with this picture, you see in green what we call biophony, with a bird call and an insect that is flying. You also have a water body, a river that is making a little of sound. This is geophony, of course. But you also have what we call sound propagation effects. These are not an example of all the sound propagation effect that happens, but you understand that they are the sounds and the way that they move across space. And from now, if we put a receiver at the center of a frame, there's no problem. The two definitions correspond to the soundscape. All the sounds are in the soundscape for the two definitions. However, if we take the flying insects and we put it in the background, then it changes, because although for Pijanowski's point of view, the insect is still in the area of the soundscape, right? The birds are actually further away. From Almo's point of view, where the receiver cannot hear the flying insects, so the flying insect is not perceived and therefore is not a part of the soundscape. So in order to understand this better, we are going to use a source filter approach, and we will build our functional diagram around this approach. On our left, we have the sound sources, geophony and biophony. And on our right, we have the filters, sound propagation filters, of course, but also the receiver, because each receiver has its specific, for example, frequency range that will change his perspective on his sonic environment. In order to understand those sounds, those sources and those filters and how they behave and change, we will use 5 types of factors to describe the mechanism that lies behind them. The first is the spatial factor, which corresponds to the topological structure and the coordinates of the studied site. The temporal factors, of course, regarding the season and the hour of the day. Biotic factors with biological activity. Abiotic factors, which will regard dynamic geophysical structures, the weather, water bodies, etc. And acoustics factors that will explain that will allow us to understand better why do some sound propagate the way it does. Now we're going to put our bricks together. We are starting to have a more complex vision of this functional diagram with the factors on the left, the sources in the middle, and the filters on the right. You can already see the complexity that lies behind the soundscape. And of course, you can see here a little bit of a feedback mechanism, because abiotic factors are going to influence geophony, but the geophony is also going to influence biotic mechanism, biotic factors. And so you can already see that there is a feedback mechanism. Now we're going to use this functional representation to go back to our definitions. First with Pijanowski's definition, well, for now it's pretty okay. We have the spatial and temporal factors. We have the ecosystem processes symbolized by abiotic and biotic factors. And we have the soundscape, which is at the level of our 2 sources, geophony and biophony, because again, we do not talk about anthropogenic sounds. But also you can see that we do not talk at all here about sound propagation, neither do we talk about the receiver. Now, if we take Almo's definition, where we can see that it corresponds more to the whole picture, with the soundscape being more of an understanding of the mechanism and of the sounds that occur in the area. It's not at the sound sources level. And you also have the sonoscape, which has, as he was talking about it a bit earlier in the afternoon, corresponds to this step between what sounds comes to the receiver and how does the receiver understand, interpret sounds. What we decided to do was to, from this understanding that we had, to define 3 different concepts. Since you can see that Pijanowski and Farina have actually a different perspective, at least with those definitions about soundscape, we wanted to take 3 different kinds of objects that we thought were really important in order to understand how we can talk about soundscape and other objects. The first is the distal object. It's our real object of study. It's what we are trying to understand. And it is the holistic reservoir of information that we are trying to access. Then there is the proximal object, which is the information that arrives to the receiver. And then there is the subjective object, which is the individual treatment of the information. Now, what the suggestion that we make is that the soundscape is the distal object. The proximal object is the acoustic scene. And the acoustic scene is similar to the visual scene for those who have heard about visual psychophysics. It is the image that comes to the individual and not the totality of the visual information that is available on a certain territory. And then we have a subjective object, and we propose to say that it is an interpretation, because we think that interpretation is very wide. It's because interpretative objects are actually very different. One of the reasons why we chose to put soundscape at the distal level was also two main reasons. Well, first, it corresponded to Pijanowski's definition, which seemed to be the most consensual among the community of acousticians, but also because we think it corresponds to the landscape definition more, because in landscape ecology, we talk about an area of land. We don't talk about the way that people understand or perceive this area. Now we go back to our functional diagram, and we are going to try to put those objects into our functional diagram. We have in the left our factors that influence sound sources and sound filters. And at the level of sources and sound propagation, we are going to have the soundscape, meaning that we pretty much take Pijanowski's point of view, adding the sound propagation element, because we think that it is an integral part of the soundscape identity. Then this soundscape is going to translate into a specific acoustic scene, meaning that there will be one soundscape, but there is a multiplicity of acoustic scenes depending on from which point of view do you hear those sounds. Then this acoustic scene is going to the receiver, which can be either an animal or a microphone. And finally, the receiver is going to deduce an interpretation. And this interpretation can be either a cognitive representation for animals, but it can also be some visualization, like, for example, a sonogram. So you can see here that there is already a complexity, but this complexity helps us understanding soundscape better, in my opinion. But what we are going to do is going to the next step. And for the final part of my presentation, I'm just going to show you what happens when you take those factors and you detail them. And here is where we are at right now, which is very complex pictures. And this tells us, in my opinion, two things. First, that soundscape are very complex indeed, that they have relationships, but it is not impossible to represent them and understand them on a 2D axis. It also tells us that maybe it would be pertinent for environment managers to have an understanding of those mechanisms, because the understanding of cause and effects is also a very good way to, well, first sensitize people about environment management, ecological management, but also because it allows them to use the tools that we produce, like ecoacoustic indices, for example, better. So to conclude, I have two main points that I would like to remind you. The first is that, in our opinion, the soundscape is today an ambiguous notion and that we need to clarify it. And we proposed three different objects: the soundscape, the acoustic scene, and interpretations. And also that the dynamics of soundscape, they can be understood and represented through a functional diagram. And the understanding of those cause and effect mechanism can help scientists and environment managers to better study and protect soundscape. Thank you very, very much. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Eli. So if you have questions, please raise the hand. Almo, of course. Almo.
Yes. Thank you very much, because you have considered with great attention the concept of soundscape. I would like to discuss another aspect. You have accepted the definition of a landscape, but you have to consider that in all these definitions, holistic definition, are definitions used by people. There is a big debate in landscape ecology about the definition of a landscape. It's my opinion, and remain my opinion, that I defend in any situation against the US pragmatism about formal concept of landscape. And it's very difficult and very hard to to have enough voice in this field, because depends by competition, number of researchers, conventional way of thinking, etc., etc. But anyway, I accept everything. My life is continuing. Also, it's another different concept of landscape. The landscape, there are for every species a landscape, believe me. Otherwise, it's impossible to afford the complexity of the life without considering the species point of view. We are discussing about landscape according a human point of view. A geographic point of view is a human point of view. So the landscape of a tiger or an elephant are completely different than the landscape of a bird, of reptiles. So I stop here because the topic of a soundscape is too delicate to be discussed in detail. We need to have a workshop or a ad hoc meeting. But remember, if you consider that the semiology of, if you consider that the environment is a collection of semiotic information, and you have to admit that every species has a specific species-specific sensing and interpretation of environment. And you can reply me, oh, it's impossible to investigate species. No, we have to approach, but we never know what a lion is thinking or what is the language of a bird. No, but this is the story. But I don't enter in the soundscape debate in this moment. But I thank very much because you have tried to define things that are so complex and so delicate. But many people don't care about semantic, but it's essential. And I appreciate your effort about this. Thank you. Sorry for a long.
Very interesting.
No. Thank you so much, Almo. This is, of course, very difficult task. We thought it was very important because we started to work with psychophysics, with psychoacoustics, and realized how this notion about the perception of the sonic environment needed to be clarified, because we found ourselves with first soundscape recordings, and then the soundscape being this, like we said before, holistic object. And so we were like, well, what are we talking about then? And we felt the need of separating those objects. And I think that the most significant aspect of this proposition is those three different kinds of objects. Although you can also say that the sonoscape can also be added as an intermediate. Like, for example, in psychoacoustic, they talk about the auditory scene, which would be kind of an equivalent of sonoscape. So I think that there is a need of separating those objects and defining them separately. It is my personal belief that the soundscape is actually not a personal perspective, that it would be a mistake, but because it is at an ecological level, and the biodiversity, the ecosystem is not something that we are able to understand directly, right? It is something that we understand through the interpretation of acoustic scenes that are that are influenced by the soundscape, or that are constructed by the soundscape. Thank you very much.
So there are some comments, you will read them afterwards. Renata asked, my question is about anthropophony and technophony. Where are you going to fit it?
I don't think I will. I mean, there is two ways of answering to your question. The first is would be kind of cheating, I think, but it would be to say that you can consider anthropophony as a form of biophony, meaning that when you look at the more complex picture, where humans do produce, and you can see on the green box biophony, intentional sounds and incidental sounds, and that all the way that for example, a car moving is an incidental sound, but a car honking is an intentional sound. So all the dynamics that are explained for biophony can be applied for anthropophony. This is the first way to include them. The other would be, well, to just complexify this schematic representation, because in my PhD, we want to work only on pristine areas or non-anthropogenic influenced areas. We will not need to do this, but I invite people if they want, because this is supposed to be put it in an article, to play this with this representation and try to see, well, how they can translate it also for marine environments, for example.
Okay, thank you very much, Eli.